Are you always the problem in your relationship? These signs point to manipulation. What if you're not the problem, but you've been trained to believe you are? Because think about it. How many times did a conversation start with something bothering you and end with you apologizing? How many times did you try to explain how you feel and somehow left feeling like you were too much, too emotional, too difficult? And after a while, you stopped questioning it. You started assuming, maybe it's me. Maybe I overreact. Maybe I'm the reason things don't work. And that's where everything changes, because once you start seeing yourself as the problem, you stop trusting your own perspective. You analyze everything you say. You rethink every reaction. You adjust your behavior just to avoid being wrong again. And the most dangerous part is this. No one has to tell you that you're the problem anymore. You already feel like you are. So you try harder. You explain more. You apologize faster. You become more careful, more controlled, more aware. Not because it's who you are, but because it's who you became inside that dynamic. And that's what manipulation really does. It doesn't force you to change. It makes you believe you need to. So pay attention, because the first sign is not what they do to you. It's what you start doing to yourself. It happens fast. Something feels off. A conversation shifts. There's tension in the air. And before you even process what just happened, you say it, "I'm sorry." Not because you clearly did something wrong, but because something inside you already assumes that you did. And that's the pattern. You don't wait to understand the situation. You don't pause to ask what actually happened. You move straight to fixing it. You apologize to calm things down. You apologize to avoid escalation. You apologize because it feels like the safest option. And at first, it feels like control. Like you're managing the situation, but look deeper. Are you resolving anything, or are you just taking responsibility automatically? Because over time, this becomes your default. Discomfort equals your fault. Tension equals your responsibility. Conflict equals something you need to fix, and that changes your role completely. You stop expressing freely. You start softening everything you say. You prepare yourself to take the blame before anything even unfolds. Not because it's true, but because it feels easier. And that's how manipulation works. Doesn't need to accuse you directly. It creates just enough pressure, just enough discomfort, just enough doubt that you step into that role yourself. And the more you do that, the more natural it becomes. Until one day, you're apologizing for things you haven't even fully understood. And that's where the shift happens. Not in what they say, but in what you start believing about yourself. At some point, your mind stops resting. You replay conversations, you rethink your tone, you go back to things you said, trying to find where you might have gone wrong. And it doesn't stop there. Before you speak, you think. So you choose your words carefully. You adjust how you say things. You anticipate how it might be received before it even leaves your mouth. And that changes everything. Because now, you're not expressing yourself. You're managing yourself. You're filtering, calculating, trying to avoid reactions before they happen. And it feels necessary because you've learned something. If you say the wrong thing, it might turn into a problem. If your tone is off, it might be misunderstood. If you don't explain yourself clearly enough, it might come back to you. So, you try to prevent all of that. You become more careful, more precise, more controlled. But here's the cost. You lose your natural flow. You stop being spontaneous. You stop speaking freely. You stop trusting that you can just be understood without overthinking everything. And instead, your mind stays active, constantly reviewing, constantly adjusting, constantly checking if you did something wrong. And that's exhausting because you're not just living the moment, you're analyzing it while it's happening. And after it's over, You analyze it again, trying to find clarity, trying to make sure you didn't miss anything, trying to confirm that you weren't the problem. But the more you do that, the more it reinforces the idea that you might be. And that's the trap. Not the overthinking itself, but what it teaches you to believe. That your natural way of being needs to be corrected at some point. You stop feeling balanced. No matter what you do, it never seems right. You express something, and it's too much. You stay quiet, and now you're distant. You react, and you're overreacting. You don't react, and you don't care enough. And slowly, a pattern forms. There's no stable ground. You're either too emotional or not emotional enough, too sensitive or too cold, too intense or too detached. And that creates something inside you, insecurity, because now you don't know where the right version of you is. You're constantly adjusting, trying to find the tone, the reaction, the behavior. That won't create a problem. But no matter how much you try, it shifts. What was okay before is now wrong. What was appreciated before is now criticized. And that instability keeps you searching for the right way to be, the right way to speak, the right version of yourself that will finally be enough. But here's the truth. There is no right version in that dynamic, because the goal is not clarity, it's inconsistency. And inconsistency keeps you off balance. It keeps you trying. It keeps you adjusting. It keeps you focused on fixing yourself instead of questioning what's happening. And over time, that does something deeper. You stop trusting who you are. You stop feeling comfortable in your own expression. You start believing that something about you needs to be corrected. And that's the shift. Not in what you do, but in how you see yourself. Because now, you're not just reacting to situations. You're trying to become someone who won't be a problem anymore. At first, it doesn't seem like a big deal. You say something bothered you. You express how you feel. You try to explain why something didn't sit right. And the response sounds calm. It's not that serious. You're overthinking. You always take things the wrong way. There's no shouting, no aggression, just dismissal. And because it sounds reasonable, you hesitate. You question yourself. Maybe it's not that big of a deal. Maybe I did overreact. Maybe I'm making this bigger than it is. And that's how it starts. Not by attacking your feelings, but by minimizing them. And when that happens repeatedly, something shifts. You stop trusting your emotional reactions. You feel something, but you don't validate it. You analyze it first. You try to measure if it's acceptable. You check if it's worth bringing up, or if it's better to stay quiet. And over time, that creates distance. Distance between what you feel and what you allow yourself to express. You start holding things in. You stop sharing openly. You become more selective about what you say. Not because you don't feel, but because you don't feel safe expressing it. And that's where the damage is, because emotions are not supposed to be filtered like that. They're supposed to be acknowledged, understood, respected. But in this dynamic, they're questioned, reduced, redirected, until one day, you don't even bring things up anymore. Not because they don't matter, but because you've learned. They won't be taken seriously. And that's the shift. You don't lose your feelings. You lose your confidence in them. At some point, it's no longer just about how you feel. It's about what you choose. Simple decisions. Start feeling heavier. What to say, what to do, how to respond. Things that used to be natural now come with hesitation. You think longer. You question more. You look for certainty before deciding anything. And that's new, because before, you trusted yourself. You made choices without overthinking every outcome. You acted without constantly checking if it was right. Now, it's different. You second guess, is this okay? Will this create a problem? Am I doing the wrong thing? And slowly, your confidence fades. Not because you became less capable, but because your decisions started being questioned repeatedly. Small corrections, subtle doubts, moments where what you chose was turned into something wrong, and over time, that leaves a mark. You stop relying on your own judgment. You start looking outward for validation. You hesitate instead of deciding, and that creates dependence, not in an obvious way, but in a quiet, internal way. You start needing reassurance. You start checking before acting. You start aligning your choices with what will be accepted. And that's the shift. You're no longer choosing freely. You're choosing carefully, trying to avoid mistakes that may not even exist. And the more that happens, the less you trust yourself, until one day, even simple decisions feel uncertain. And that's where manipulation reaches deeper. Not when you follow someone, but when you stop trusting yourself enough to lead your own choices. At some point, the guilt doesn't need a reason anymore. It's just there. You're not arguing. Nothing is happening. There's no clear conflict. And still, you feel it. A subtle weight, like you did something wrong. Even when you can't point to what, you stay quiet and feel like you should say something. You say something and feel like you shouldn't have. You do nothing and still feel like it's not right. And that's what makes it so confusing, because guilt is supposed to come from action, from something you did. But here, it comes from presence, from simply existing in the situation. And that changes how you move. You become more cautious, more aware, more focused on not creating problems, even when there aren't any. You walk carefully, not because something is happening, but because something might happen. And that constant anticipation creates tension, even in calm moments, even in silence. And over time, that becomes your baseline. You don't feel relaxed. You feel controlled, not by rules, but by the fear of being wrong again. And that's the final layer, because now no one needs to correct you. No one needs to question you. No one needs to point anything out. You're already doing it yourself. And that's what keeps the cycle going. Not external pressure, internal guilt, a feeling that follows you even when nothing is happening. And that's when you need to pause. Because guilt without a clear reason is not clarity. It's conditioning at this point. It's no longer about the arguments. It's no longer about specific situations. It's about what you started believing. Because the biggest shift didn't happen in what they said to you. It happened in how you started seeing yourself. You began questioning your reactions, doubting your thoughts, adjusting your behavior before anything even happened, and now it feels normal, but it's not, because you weren't always like this. There was a time when you trusted your instincts, when you spoke without overthinking every word, when you didn't feel like everything needed to be corrected. And that version of you didn't disappear. It was slowly replaced, not by force, but by repetition. Moments where things got turned around, where you felt wrong, even when you weren't sure why, where you adapted just to keep things stable. And that's the truth. You didn't become the problem. You were placed in that position over time, through patterns that made you question yourself again and again, until it became automatic. And that's what keeps you stuck. Not the person, but the belief. The belief that you are difficult, that you are too much, that you are the reason things don't work. Because once you believe that, you stop questioning the situation, and you start fixing yourself. And that's where everything changes. The moment you see this clearly, you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" And you start asking something more honest. What made me start believing this about myself? Because that answer is what breaks the cycle. Everything begins to shift the moment you stop looking at isolated moments and start seeing what keeps repeating. Because this was never about one conversation, or one misunderstanding, or one reaction. It's about a pattern, the same outcome. In different situations, you speak and end up apologizing. You feel something and end up questioning it. You react and somehow become the problem. Different moments, same result. And when you look at each situation separately, it feels explainable. Like maybe that one time you did overreact. Maybe that moment you could have handled better. So you keep adjusting, trying to fix each situation, trying to make each moment work, trying to avoid the same outcome again. But it keeps happening, and that's what you need to see. It's not random, it's consistent. And consistency means there's a structure behind it. Because patterns don't form by accident. They form through repetition, through dynamics that lead you to the same place, again and again. And once you step back and connect the dots, something becomes clear. It's not about you getting it wrong. It's about the dynamic leading you to feel that way. And that awareness changes your position completely. You stop reacting to each moment. You stop trying to fix everything individually. You start observing. And when you observe a pattern clearly, you stop taking it personally. You stop asking, "What did I do wrong this time?" And you start asking, "Why does this always end the same way?" And that question is where clarity begins. At some point, blaming yourself became your first reaction, not your last, your first. Something happens, and before you even understand it, you assume it must be you. You look inward. You question your behavior. You search for what you did wrong, even before knowing if you did anything at all. And that's not natural. That's learned. Because when you're repeatedly placed in situations where things turn back on you, your mind adapts. It tries to solve the problem faster. If I find what I did wrong, I can fix it. If I take responsibility, this won't escalate. If I adjust myself, things will be okay. And that creates a pattern. You skip the understanding and go straight to the blame. You don't pause to evaluate. You don't step back to observe. You don't question the situation. You go straight to yourself. And over time, that becomes automatic. You don't even notice it anymore. But look at what that does. You stop seeing the full picture. You stop considering other possibilities. You stop questioning the dynamic itself. Because you're too focused on fixing yourself. And that keeps you stuck. Because if you're always the problem, you'll always be the one trying to change. And the situation never shifts. So the change begins here. Not by immediately defending yourself, but by pausing before you assume, before you take responsibility, before you say, "It's my fault." You ask something different. Is this actually mine to carry? Because not everything that feels like your fault belongs to you. And the moment you create that space, you start breaking the pattern. At some point, you stop trusting yourself, not because you became incapable, but because you were taught to question everything you feel, think, and do. And when that happens repeatedly, something breaks. Not your ability to think. Your confidence in your own thinking. You hesitate before deciding. You question your reactions. You look for confirmation before trusting your own judgment. And that creates distance. Distance between you and your own voice. Because now, your decisions don't come from clarity. They come from doubt. From trying to get it right. From trying not to be wrong again. From trying to avoid the feeling of being the problem. And that's what needs to be rebuilt. Not your behavior. Your trust in yourself. And it starts with something simple. You begin to listen again. When something feels off, you don't ignore it. When something doesn't sit right, you don't justify it immediately. When something affects you, you acknowledge it. Not because you have all the answers, but because your perception matters. And the more you do that, the stronger it becomes. You stop needing constant reassurance. You stop looking outward for validation. You stop second-guessing every choice. And slowly, something returns. Certainty. Not about everything, but about yourself. And that changes how you move. You decide without overthinking. You speak without filtering every word. You act without constantly checking if it's acceptable, because now you trust your own position. And that's what breaks the cycle, not understanding the situation better, but trusting yourself enough to no longer abandon your own perspective. At some point, you stopped taking your feelings seriously, not because they disappeared, but because you learned they might be wrong. So instead of feeling and accepting, you started evaluating. Is this too much? Am I overreacting? Should I even feel this way? And before you even allow the emotion, you question it, you filter it, you minimize it, you try to make it reasonable before it's even expressed. And that creates distance. Because now, your emotions are not something you trust. There's something you need to approve first. And that changes everything. You feel something, but you don't stand by it. You react, but then you step back and doubt it. You experience something and then try to shrink it. And over time, that weakens your connection to yourself. Because emotions are not meant to be negotiated. They're meant to be understood. They are signals. They show you what matters, what affects you, what doesn't feel right. But when those signals are constantly questioned, they lose strength, and that's where confusion grows. So the shift begins here. You stop asking if your feelings are valid. You start accepting that they exist for a reason. You feel something, and instead of correcting it, you explore it. What is this telling me? Why did this affect me? What does this say about what I need or what I'm not okay with? Because your emotions are not the problem. They are information. And the moment you start validating them, you reconnect with yourself. You stop needing permission to feel. You stop waiting for someone to agree. You stop shrinking what you experience just to make it easier for someone else. And that's where your clarity begins to return. At this point, you're no longer confused. You see the pattern. You understand what changed. You recognize how it affected you. So now, the question is different. It's not what's happening. It's what do I choose to do with this? Because awareness gives you something powerful. Choice, not emotional reaction, not automatic behavior. Choice. You're no longer responding out of habit. You're no longer adjusting without noticing. You're no longer blaming yourself without questioning. You see clearly. And that means whatever you do next is intentional. You can stay knowing exactly what this dynamic does to you, how it makes you feel, how it changes the way you see yourself. Or you can step back, not because you don't care, but because you understand what it's costing you. And this is where it becomes real. Because clarity removes confusion, but it doesn't remove attachment. You can still care and know something is not right. You can still feel connected and know it's affecting you. You can still want it to work and know it's hurting you. And that's what makes the decision difficult. But now, you're not choosing blindly. You're choosing with full awareness. And that changes everything. Because you're no longer asking, is this my fault? You're asking, is this something I want to continue living? And that answer is what defines your next step. You were not always like this. You didn't always question your words. You didn't always doubt your feelings. You didn't always feel like you had to fix everything. That version of you still exists. But it got buried. Not in one moment, not in one argument, in small shifts, moments where you adjusted, moments where you stayed quiet, moments where you chose peace over yourself, and slowly. That became normal. But here's the truth. You were never the problem. You were placed in a position where you had to become one. And the more you tried to fix it, the more you lost yourself in the process, until one day, you didn't even recognize how much you had changed. But awareness changes that. Because now, you see it. You see the pattern. You see the impact. You see what it did to the way you think, feel, and respond. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. And that's where your power is. Not in going back to who you were, but in choosing who you become now. Someone who doesn't automatically take the blame. Someone who doesn't silence their own voice. Someone who doesn't shrink to make things easier. Someone who trusts themselves again. Because the moment you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start saying, "I deserve clarity, I deserve respect, I deserve to feel like myself again," that's the moment everything begins to change. Not around you, inside you. And the moment you return to yourself, you stop feeling like the problem. You start feeling like you again.